Hey everyone, how's it going? I come to you with a video that's a little bit different, and it's a little bit ironic that I'm posting this video and haven't posted a top books of 2020 yet, but I have had a really hard time putting together a top books of 2020 video for some reason, but for some reason I did feel like I could come to you with a top movies of 2020, and I should obviously preface this by saying that these are movies that I watched in 2020, not necessarily movies that were released in 2020, and actually, in fact, there are none that were released in 2020, although there are two that were actually released in 2019, so I'm not entirely, off the grid in terms of contemporary cinema, but most of these are sort of backlist, to use the booktube term for them. Most of them are at least from a few years ago, if not from decades and decades ago. But yeah, so I've watched more movies in 2020 than I've watched in any other year of my life. I think the pandemic was a bit of a shot in the arm for it, because I, didn't have anywhere to go, obviously. I was working from home, and that provided some extra time, at least, because I wasn't commuting, and so on and so forth. And I had been wanting to get more into cinema for a long time, and yeah, it just seemed like something clicked in 2020. I think, again, it was sort of having extra time from the pandemic, but also like my interactions with Jason from Old with Chapter and Verse, and just watching some great cinema, getting more interested in certain directors and sort of learning more about the art form of cinema, I think, just finally built up enough for me to really, just dive headfirst into watching, a couple of movies every week at least. But I think I ended up watching about 150 movies in 2020, and, a lot of them were really, really good. And I did have to leave a lot of extraordinary films off this list. And I should say, obviously, that these are my top movies of 2020. It would be interesting for me to share all the movies I watched in 2020, but I can't really do that. I don't have them saved on an Excel file or anything, but it would be interesting for me to do that and let you just see just how many great movies I watched in 2020. I mean, you would probably be able to just pick out the names, but this is my top 10, okay? Your top 10 would be different if we were developing a top 10 based on, sort of objective criteria from, a panel of film buffs. Some of these might not be on the list, and others that I watched would be, but again, this is subjective. I like to think that I sort of evaluate movies on a reasonably, rigorous level, but, again, these cater to my own personal taste, so I will stop blathering and get into the movies. This is an unranked list. I have ordered them in alphabetical order by the title, so there's no ranking of any sorts here. But anyway, that's my only note going in. So the first film is a 2014 film directed by Olivier Assayas called Clouds of Sils Maria. And this stars Juliette Binoche and Kristen Stewart. Juliette Binoche plays an actress who is extremely famous, and Kristen Stewart plays her assistant. And Juliette Binoche's character is approached at the beginning of the movie to play a role in a play that she's been in before. And in this play, it's about two women, one who is sort of middle-aged and one who is 18, 19, or 20, very, very young, and about the romance that develops between the two of them, but which falls apart. The younger woman ends up sort of ruining the middle-aged woman's life. And the significant thing about this play is that Juliette Binoche's character made her career, sort of she was put on the spotlight by playing the younger woman in this play when she was the same age as that woman. And now that Juliette Binoche's character is sort of in middle age, a theater director has approached her and asked her to play the older role, and the director will find a new younger actress to play the younger woman. And Juliette Binoche's character reluctantly agrees, and this is a movie all about her and her assistant preparing her to play this role, And what's really interesting about this movie is that it explores the difference between acting and real life. There are these scenes where Juliette Binoche and Kristen Stewart's characters are rehearsing lines with each other, and Kristen Stewart's character is much younger, and so you see the parallels there. And they're rehearsing these lines, and you kind of get the sense that there are points where it's more about the two of them than it is about the play itself. But so it's about the difference between acting and real life. It's about celebrity and how our society treats the celebrities. The young woman who's going to play the younger woman in the play is this very sort of eccentric, difficult person. She has a rather erratic life, and she kind of embodies a sort of modern idea of celebrity, or a modern incarnation of celebrity, and so it's about that, and it's about identity, because, you know, the assistant, Kristen Stewart's character, you know, her identity is kind of really sort of subservient to her identity as this woman's assistant, and so it's about that, and it's also about how Juliette Binoche's character identifies with these two characters, you know, because she identifies so strongly with the younger character that she at first struggles with getting into the role of the older character, and she struggles with her own sort of aging in that sense, and so it's about a lot of things. As Olivier Assayas, the director, a lot of his movies are about a lot of things at once, and this is one where that is particularly controlled, and he does it really well. So this is a movie that I've talked a lot of people's ears off about. So anyway, I definitely recommend it. But the next film is a complete shift in tone. So this is a 1985 Russian film directed by Elem Klimov, and it's called Come and See. And this takes place in what's now Belarus, what was then the Soviet Union, during World War II. And it's about a young boy named Florian whose entire village is destroyed by the Nazis. And he ends up joining the Soviet military to fight against the Nazis, but it's really just about his experience in this town, you know, with this horrific thing happening, which happened all across Belarus. You know, systematically, the Nazis destroyed village after village after village in Eastern Europe in a systematic attempt to just destroy the people there and clear the land for Germans to move in, basically. And it is one of the most harrowing films that I've ever seen. It makes you feel this horrific experience in a way that no other film could. And what's so brilliant about the way that that's done, by the way that this horror and how horrible it is that was done is conveyed, is that it's done without really any on-screen violence. There's no shot wounds except for maybe one scene. There's hardly any blood. There's no physical attacking of anyone that you see. It does happen, but you don't see any of it. All of the horror and the fear and, you know, this idea of man's inhumanity to man and certain people's inability to view other people as human beings is all conveyed through acting, in particular a brilliant lead performance by the young Alexei Kravchenko, who was, I think, 13 when the movie was shot. He is brilliant, but also the camera work in it is really interesting and innovative and very, very subjective, and a really eerie soundtrack by Oleg Yanchenko. It's just an incredible piece of work, and one of the most powerful movies I've ever seen. But I will just say that when this movie was released theatrically, there were some people who didn't take it well, who had to actually be taken away from the movie theater in ambulances. So, you know, I think, you know, you should be careful about, you know, your own sensitivities if you're thinking of watching, you know what I mean? But that being said, this is kind of a movie that I wish everyone would watch, because it is about a particular historical moment, of course, but it is universal in its message and just as relevant as it was when it was made, and just as relevant as it was when in the time that it took place, and relevant probably throughout all of human history. So yes, this is an incredibly powerful film, but probably, emotionally speaking, the most difficult film that I'm going to talk about here. The third film is another lengthy film, and probably the most demanding in terms of length, and it's also a bit of a cheat. So this is The Immigrants and the New Land, which are actually technically two films. I'm going to get that in a second, but this is a Swedish film directed by Jan Troell, and the two films were released in 1971 and 1972, respectively. And it's a bit of a cheat, of course, because they're kind of two movies, but they're really two parts of one huge epic, and so the reason I said that this is the most demanding entry in terms of length is because both of these films are 3 hours long, so the whole thing together is 6 hours. But the nice thing is you can watch them both separately, so you can just watch them as 2 separate 3-hour movies, but even one 3-hour movie is demanding. But anyway, to get what the movie is about, it is about a Swedish couple who are played by Liv Ullmann and Max von Sydow, played brilliantly by 2 of them. They have such great chemistry in this movie. But they play... at the beginning of the movie, they are a young, newly married Swedish couple living in Sweden who struggle to make a living in Sweden, struggle to, just feed their family, make a living, and so on and so forth. And the first film, The Immigrants, is about them eventually deciding to move to the United States and make a new life there, because they realize they're just struggling too much, they can't live in Sweden anymore. And so part of the film is about them struggling to live in Sweden, part of it is about their trek to the United States on a ship. And the new land is about them trying to make a new life in Minnesota. And it's also, to a degree, about the conflict that develops between the white settlers in Minnesota and the Native Americans there. And this is such a humble film. It doesn't have it doesn't have any lofty pretensions. It doesn't shove any philosophy down your throat or anything like that. But it explores so many themes so subtly and so well. It's about being a wife and about being a husband. It's about being a parent. It's about the American dream, and kind of not only the fact that the American dream often never delivered for most people, but also the fact that the American dream was built on the dispossession of Native Americans. I think that this is one of the best films for looking at the American dream while keeping the fact that it's built on genocide in mind. And the fact that that was done by a Swedish director, I think is extremely interesting. I don't know that any American director that I've encountered has quite captured that in that way. But it's also about death. Death hangs over this film, and it is just a wonderment. It's, again, I think probably what carries. And what another thing that I love about the movie is that it explores learning a new language. So when these Swedish immigrants come to the United States, they need to learn English. And I really loved that it portrayed their struggles to learn English, because I don't know that that's often portrayed in immigrant stories. And it was really cool to see Max von Sydow's character, in particular, build, his English vocabulary as he lived in the United States. But yeah, it's a great film, great, humble, but profound, beautifully shot film. First of the Swedish countryside, and then of Minnesota, which is obviously a lovely state. So yeah, if you can stomach the lengthy running time, then I obviously recommend it. The next film, the fourth film, is the first of the 2 that was released in 2019. This is a film directed by my favorite director ever, Terrence Malick, and this is A Hidden Life, which is about Hans Jägerstätter, who was, incidentally, this film also takes place during World War II, interestingly, but this film is very different from Come and See. It is about Hans Jägerstätter, who was an Austrian man who was a conscientious objector during World War II. He refused to fight in the Nazi army, and this film is about his decision to do that and the consequences that he faces. You can probably imagine what happens to him by the end of the movie. I won't spoil it, although he's a historical figure, so you can't really spoil history. But anyway, you can imagine what he goes through, but then it also looks at the effect that it has on his wife, on his mother, on his children, and on the people in his town and how they respond to it. And it is such a lovely film. It has one of the best soundtracks I've heard in a long time. Such a gorgeous, just bittersweet soundtrack by James Newton Howard. But it's just a film about how little acts of resistance are really what save civilization. Constantly there are people yelling in Hans Jägerstätter's face that what he's doing won't save anyone, won't do anything, which is so ironic, of course, because as they're yelling in his face, frothing at the mouth, they are proving that what he's doing in fact is having an effect. Because why would they throw him in prison and beat him if it weren't going to have an effect? But it's also just again, like Come and See, it's a universal story about faith and about love, about marriage, about death, about again, man's inhumanity to man. What we as decent people or people of faith can do in the face of man's inhumanity to man. And I will say that I am not one to cry while reading books or watching movies or much of anything, but this movie made me cry not once but twice, so there's that. So anyway, that is A Hidden Life. Number 5. Okay, number 5 is probably the film that is the most inaccessible, not in terms of the emotional weight of what's going on, but in terms of just how difficult of a film that it is formally. So this is a 1967 Czech film directed by František Vlachil, and it is called Marcella Lazarova. Now, this film came out around the same time as Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, and they are often called kind of sister films because they have a very similar aesthetic. They're both Eastern European. They have similar sort of themes, and they both take place in a medieval setting. So Marcella Lazarova is about the title character, Marcella Lazarova, who is kidnapped by kind of a clan called the Kozlik clan, who are kind of Christians, recent converts to Christianity, but haven't quite actually embraced Christianity very well, so they still sort of follow these sort of old, sort of brutish pagan customs and are kind of brutish in their own way. This takes place during a kind of fascinating time in history when, Christianity was starting to take over in Europe, but paganism was still very present. And so it's about Marcella Lazarova being kidnapped and forming a relationship with one of her captors. And that is one of the sort of problematic aspects of the story that may be distasteful to a modern audience, is that she forms this relationship with a captor, you know what I mean? But the film is incredibly dark. It's populated by a bunch of horrible people. I think Marcella Lazarova herself might be the only person who qualifies as not a terrible person in this movie, but it's also extremely opaque in its storytelling style, and it can be extremely difficult to follow, and so that's why it's the most sort of demanding film on this list, I think, is because it's just very hard to follow. I had to read Wikipedia summaries along the way as I watched it, and doing that, I got a lot out of it. I think if you are on this film's wavelength, then it can be a wonderment. And I haven't really cracked it open and figured out what it's saying or what it's doing, but I feel like that will come in future viewings. And for now, I can just say that it is a gorgeously shot film. It's dark, it's gritty. It's Andrei Rublev, for example, is rounded and lovely in that sense, but this film is angular and cracked and spiky, but it's beautiful in that way. So that's Marcella Lazarova. All right. The next movie is funny that it's coming right after Marcella Lazarova, because it was released the next year after Marcella Lazarova, in 1968, but it's completely different in tone. So this is Once Upon a Time in the West, which is Sergio Leone's great epic western, probably my favorite western of all time. There are a lot of westerns I haven't seen, but of the ones that I have seen, I think that this one is my favorite. And obviously this film, is different from Marcella Lazarova in almost every way, although they do use actually some of the same techniques, actually. We watched Marcella Lazarova in our Wednesday film club that Jason from Chapter and Verse and I host, and someone pointed out that actually there's a lot of similarity between the filmic techniques used by Sergio Leone and used by František Vlachil in Marcella Lazarova, but anyway, I don't know how much of an introduction this movie needs, but, it's a great spaghetti western. Sergio Leone's films are like operas. Like half of what makes them so incredible is just the Ennio Morricone score. And I think Ennio Morricone is probably my favorite film composer, maybe. I don't know, he does face some stiff competition, but he's certainly one of the best. And what's really cool about Once Upon a Time in the West in particular, but all of Leone's films, is that when we think of how a score for a film is composed, we usually think of the, director doing the shooting, getting the film made, and then showing it to the composer, and then the composer sort of writing music to go with what he's shown or she's shown. But Sergio Leone did it differently. He actually had Ennio Morricone work on the soundtrack while he wrote the script, and then shot the movie to fit the music to a certain degree. So what you're watching in Once Upon a Time in the West is Sergio Leone fitting his own movie to Ennio Morricone's music. And I think that that's what gives this feeling of an opera, right? Because opera obviously is a theatrical art form, a storytelling art form, but where theater and storytelling always have to be sort of subservient to music. And so Once Upon a Time in the West is made a little bit like an opera. But I feel like there are so many other things that are incredible about Once Upon a Time in the West. You know, it has Henry Fonda playing a villain, you know, cast against type, and doing a great job. But, you know, the thing that I love the most about it is just that I don't think that any other director could make a man trying to catch a fly on his cheek as mesmerizing as Sergio Leone does. If people have seen the movie, you'll know what scene I'm talking about. And if you haven't seen the movie, I can probably say without... it's not really a spoiler, but the very first scene, there's a man trying to catch a fly on his cheek, and it's one of the most mesmerizing things you'll ever see. But I think that facility for grabbing your attention and holding it is so great. And yeah, and just lovely cinematography of the American West. It was actually Leone's only film to be shot in the United States, ironically, for a director who's so closely associated with the Western, which is kind of a quintessentially American genre. But anyway, so that's Once Upon a Time in the West. And the next film is moving forward in time again. This is the second movie that was released in 2019. This is A Portrait of a Lady on Fire, directed by Céline Sciamma. And this film is still on Hulu, so if you have Hulu and you haven't watched this movie, then you should just go watch it, because it's an art house film, for sure. But it's one of the only art house films where I'm just about certain any viewer, even viewers who don't like art house cinema, would enjoy the heck out of, because it is incredibly gripping from beginning to end. And so what this film is about, it takes place in the 18th century. It's about a painter, a woman painter, who is commissioned to paint a portrait of this other woman who's a little bit younger than her, probably, who is about to get married. And so she's painting this portrait for her marriage, and it's about the relationship between the two of them and the romance that develops between the two of them. And what I think makes this film so gripping is just because it's carried by just mesmerizing performances by the two leads. You know, it's carried by this brilliantly acted and so well written love story, but there are so many levels on which this movie is working thematically that I just can't do justice to here. But, you know, it's about art, the making of art, and about the gaze and how we look at each other, and how, you know, when we gaze at each other, we're sort of doing the work of an artist, you know what I mean? When we look at someone else, get to know someone else, we're doing a similar thing that a writer or a director or a painter does. We're just not sort of committing it to paper or to canvas or to film or something like this. And we're doing, yeah, and I think that's just so fascinating. And it's about the role of women in the 18th century as well, and about so many other things. But, you know, it's a film about a painter that looks itself like a painting. It's just absolutely gorgeous and so well written and so engaging, and there are so many aspects of it that I just know I can't do justice to. But, you know, I think whether you are a fan of art house cinema or not, you should go watch this, because, again, trust me, if you don't like art house cinema, you will still love this movie, I think. So anyway, that's Portrait of a Lady on Fire. The last three films I'm going to talk about are all old-ish. Two are from the 1950s and one is from 1939. But the first of these last three is a Japanese film. Weirdly, the only Japanese film that made it onto this list, even though I feel like I watched a lot of Japanese films this year. But it's Sancho the Bailiff from 1954, directed by the great Kenji Mizoguchi. And this is a powerful film, and beautiful. You know, Kenji Mizoguchi is really well known for his sort of mise-en-scène and his long takes, and I'm a sucker for all of that. But this is a powerful film about just how poorly people who try to do the right thing are often treated, and what to do in a world that does that to good people. And that's about as simply as I can sum it up without going into a whole-scale summary of the entire plot. But it is a powerful film. It's a difficult film emotionally. Still not quite as difficult as Come and See, but it's hard to beat Come and See in those terms. But it is so good, and you know, will absolutely reward rewatches. And next up, we jump backwards in time even from there. This is a 1939 film, and it's another Western. It's a Stagecoach, directed by John Ford, and no less than John Ford, of course, one of the greatest directors of all time. Many would say the greatest director of all time, and I would have a hard time arguing with them. But this is a Western that is of a completely different order from Once Upon a Time in the West. You know, Once Upon a Time in the West is sort of an anti-Western in a way because, you know, it's very gritty, it's very dark and sad, although it has a happy ending, but it you know, a lot of terrible things happen in it, and you're kind of seeing the darker side of the West. But Stagecoach is sort of the quintessential classic Western. You know, it does have a bittersweet ending, but mostly it has, you know, a lighthearted tone, and, you know, has a pretty simple story, a deceptively simple story. You know, it's of course about a group of people who hop in a stagecoach and want to get from one town to another, ostensibly in, I believe, Texas, although it was shot in Monument Valley, which is on the border between Utah and Arizona, and the first film of many that John Ford would shoot in Monument Valley. And it's deceptively simple because it's really working on a lot of different levels, I think. It has a lot of thematic complexity to it. It is extremely socially subversive. You know, you have one character who's sort of kind of the main character, who is a prostitute, who starts off, you know, looked down upon by everyone she's with because she's a prostitute. But she, by the end of the movie, is sort of exalted. You know, she comes out as the most exalted character, and also the most motherly character, in a way. And then you have, of course, John Wayne's character. This is sort of the movie that put John Wayne on the map, and you have him. He's an outlaw, but then he also is sort of the most, you know, he is the character in the movie who performs justice in a way. And then you have like this character who is an alcoholic doctor who seems, you know, kind of like a bum, but he sort of comes out as the moral center of this movie. And then the characters who were all ostensibly sort of high society people who were supposed to be, you know, good people, come out as kind of snobs, you know, and are sort of humbled in this movie. And so it is socially subversive. I think it has a lot of other really interesting, more sort of philosophical themes in it. But you know, if you're turning your nose up at it because it's a classic Western, then I would say don't do that, because it's beautiful. John Ford has such a great way with framing shots. You know, he can go from this just breathtaking wide shot of Monument Valley, of this gorgeous landscape, to a really intimate, kind of almost expressionist style cinema that's you know, indoors and has a lot of shadow in it, and it's a beautiful, beautiful film. John Ford is fast becoming a favorite director of mine. So anyway, that's Stagecoach. And then the last film. You know, there's one name that has sort of stayed in the shadows here, and some people who know what I've been watching and know about my film interests will be wondering where this name has been in this whole video, in this rather long video. But here he is. This is the sole entry, directed by Ingmar Bergman. This is his 1951 film, his 1951 film called Summer Interlude. And so I watched a lot of Bergman in 2020. He is another director who I have grown to love in the past year. I think I've watched something like 15 of his films now, and not all of them in 2020, but anyway, this is, again, the film that kind of put him on the map. You know, he had made other films before this, but this was really the one that made his name, that made people pay attention to him. And you can see in it a lot of the elements that would become really prominent in a lot of his other films. You have one character who plays chess with another character and talks about death, so you can see the seventh seal in that. You have the main character who is an artist who is kind of all consumed by her art. It's about a ballet dancer and her sort of coming in of age and finding love for the first time and finding loss for the first time. And that certainly is a big theme in a lot of Bergman's other work, you know, loss of innocence, first love, and this sort of thing. It's also about a faith and loss and a crisis of faith that she goes through. I think that if I were to show you all the films by Bergman that I watched in 2020, you would probably be kind of puzzled that this is the one that I put on my top movies list, because, you know, I watched some undoubted masterpieces by him. I watched, Autumn Sonata, for example. I rewatched Cries and Whispers. I watched Summer with Monica. I watched a lot of films by him that are classics, that are revered as, pinnacles of the film canon. But this is the one that made it onto the list. And I think that part of the reason goes back to what I said at the beginning of this movie, which is that these movies cater to my taste, not to anyone else's or to the film canon's taste or anything like this. And the fact of the matter is that this is a film about the making of an artist, and it's a coming-of-age story about finding love and finding loss and struggling with faith and struggling with the people in your life. And all those press my buttons so forcefully, because I love stories about artists. I love stories that are coming-of-age stories, and so this film just touched me in a way that none of the other Bergman films that I watched did. I think because of a combination of those things. And but that's not to say that this isn't a masterpiece, in my opinion. I would hold this up against Autumn Sonata or Cries and Whispers, or maybe not quite Persona, maybe not quite The Seventh Seal, but definitely against something like Summer with Monica or Wild Strawberries. I think that this easily stands alongside them. But when I say that people might be puzzled by this choice, is just, again, it's not generally considered Bergman's greatest film. But when a movie is not quite Ingmar Bergman's greatest film, that still makes it better than most other movies that have been made. So anyway, that's Summer Interlude. I would love to hear from people who've watched any of these movies or want to watch any of these movies. Give me your thoughts, of course. But, here's to another year of watching film, experiencing great cinema. And, yeah, I will leave it at that and talk to you all later.